Back then, the world was frozen between fear and fire. Most people remembered the beaches of Normandy, the thunder of artillery, the courage of men charging into the surf. But far from the blood and smoke, somewhere beyond the reach of any soldier's dream, another war was being fought, silent, invisible, and cold. It's funny. People think wars are won by bullets and tanks, but sometimes it's the wind, the clouds, and the temperature that decide who lives and who dies. They called it Wetterstation Haudegen, a lonely German outpost buried in the Arctic ice, so remote that the men stationed there saw no combat, no civilians, no sign of life except the endless night and the howl of polar winds. Imagine it, an island so desolate, so far north that even compasses struggled to behave. The sun would vanish for months, and when it returned, it painted the ice in ghostly gold. The Arctic was a graveyard of silence. The year was 1944. By then, the Third Reich was crumbling. The Allies had stormed through Italy. Bombers screamed over Berlin every night, and Hitler's promises of victory were turning into whispers of desperation. Yet, in a secret office in occupied Norway, a handful of German scientists were being briefed on a mission that, if successful, could change everything. Their task was not to fire a weapon, but to read the sky. Weather, the invisible weapon. It determined when fleets could sail, when planes could fly, and when armies could march. Every major operation of the war, from Rommel's desert campaigns to the bombing of London, had danced to the rhythm of the atmosphere. And now, as the Allies prepared for something massive, something that would decide the fate of Europe, the German High Command grew desperate to know, when would they strike? To predict that, they needed to know the weather, not just anywhere, but in the North Atlantic, where the storms were born.
That's where Haudegen came in. Wetterstation Haudegen was to be Germany's last and most secret meteorological outpost, stationed deep in the Arctic archipelago of Svalbard, an icy nowhere between the North Pole and Norway. The mission was led by Dr. Wilhelm Deege, a quiet, determined scientist, not a soldier. He had no illusions about glory. His team were meteorologists, radio operators, technicians, men of numbers and charts, not rifles and grenades. Yet what they were about to do could change the course of the war more than any panzer division. They set sail aboard a U-boat, U-307, carrying supplies, instruments, and radio equipment. The voyage was perilous. Allied aircraft patrolled the Norwegian Sea, and the Arctic itself was merciless. Ice floes scraped the hull like claws, and sub-zero temperatures froze the steel itself. After weeks of navigating treacherous waters, they reached their destination, a barren island called Nordostlanden. No trees, no people, no shelter, just ice, rock, and the echo of the wind. They built their camp by hand, naming it Haudegen, the veteran. Wooden huts, antennas, a generator, and a radio tower that pointed toward Berlin, their only link to the world. And so began the most isolated mission of the war. Every day they recorded temperatures, barometric pressure, wind speeds, and cloud formations. Hour after hour, they transmitted coded weather reports to Germany. It was monotonous, repetitive work, but vital. Those small packets of data would be fed into the Luftwaffe's forecasting systems, guiding bomber missions and naval operations. But what the men of Haudegen didn't know was that far to the south, another group of meteorologists, British and American, were doing the same, feeding data to Eisenhower's invasion planners. The skies were a battlefield too, only the soldiers were men of science. And sometimes the Arctic gave warnings no one else could see. By spring of 1944, the Allied codebreakers had begun picking up hints of secret weather transmissions from the Arctic. But the source was so faint, so sporadic, that they dismissed it as routine German chatter. They didn't know it came from a place untouched by war and yet vital to its outcome. Meanwhile, the men at Haudegen faced a war of their own. Temperatures dropped to -40. Their breath froze in midair. The oil in their rifles congealed, and the endless darkness of the polar winter pressed on their sanity like a weight. One of them, Corporal Heinz Schneider, wrote in his diary, "No sound but the wind and the ticking of instruments. Sometimes I dream of birds. Even a single one would make me weep." Imagine being so far removed from humanity that a bird becomes a miracle. Dr. Dedge tried to keep morale alive, reading poetry, organizing chess tournaments, keeping them busy with routine. But the radio, that was their lifeline. Every few hours they'd tune in to Berlin, send coded transmissions, and wait for replies that sometimes never came. They didn't know the war was changing. They didn't know the Allies were about to launch Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in history. And as the world prepared for D-Day, the Arctic winds carried truths that could have changed everything. Because in those frozen transmissions was a message no one fully understood. The weather was turning violently. The Arctic didn't care who won the war. It swallowed flags, uniforms, and ideologies alike, turning everything into the same endless white. For the men of Wetterstation Haudegen, days blurred into weeks, and weeks into months. Each morning began the same way, The low hum of the generator sputtering to life, frost cracking on the wooden beams, and the slow ritual of checking instruments coated in rhyme. They were meteorologists, not warriors, but in their own quiet way, they were soldiers of precision, fighting chaos with numbers and logic. Dr. Wilhelm Deege, the station leader, believed that their mission had purpose, that their readings would help Germany survive the storms ahead. Every 3 hours, day and night, he and his men recorded temperature, wind direction, humidity, and barometric pressure. Every 6 hours they encoded these observations and transmitted them in Morse code to the German Naval Meteorological Command. The irony? They never heard a single word back. They didn't know that the Luftwaffe's forecasting office in Hamburg was itself in chaos, bombed, understaffed, and half their messages lost in the static of war. Still, they worked. Routine was survival. In the Arctic, time only had meaning if you gave it one. Corporal Schneider, the radio operator, developed frostbite so severe that 2 of his fingers turned black. He wrapped them in rags and kept typing. If I stop sending, then maybe the world will forget we exist. And maybe he wasn't wrong. They lived on canned meat, powdered milk, and hardtack so dry it had to be soaked in melted snow. On good days, they hunted seals. On bad days, they just watched the ice move, slow, grinding, eternal. At night, the aurora danced overhead, green curtains of fire waving silently across the black. Sometimes they stood outside for hours just staring. It reminded them that beauty could survive even here, at the end of the world. But as 1944 bled into 1945, the Arctic began to whisper warnings that no one wanted to hear. The barometer dropped, the winds shifted, the polar front began moving south with terrifying force. Dr. Deege's logbooks from late May record something extraordinary. A sudden pattern of pressure systems forming in the North Atlantic, moving toward the English Channel. He didn't know what it meant, not exactly, but in Berlin, if anyone had been listening, those numbers would have screamed one truth. A storm was coming. Far to the south, in England, Allied commanders faced the same uncertainty. Eisenhower, Montgomery, and the meteorologists of the Royal Air Force gathered daily to argue about one thing: the weather. The invasion fleet was ready. Men were in their landing craft. Paratroopers stood by. But one bad storm could drown the entire operation. The decision rested on forecasts. Allied meteorologists had limited Atlantic data. Most of their northern stations were gone, destroyed or captured. They relied on a few scattered ships, some stations in Greenland, and fragments of readings from the ocean. But if they had Haudegen's data, if they had those precise Arctic readings, they might have seen it sooner. They might have delayed the invasion, or changed its date entirely. And conversely, if the Germans had acted on Haudegen's signals, if Berlin had trusted those Arctic numbers instead of dismissing them, they could have known the same. They could have anticipated the storm that hit the Channel just before D-Day and positioned their forces differently. It's strange to think that a handful of frozen men on a forgotten island held in their notebooks and weather charts the fate of millions. But no one was listening. By summer, Haudegen's transmissions grew erratic. Their batteries were failing. Their radio vacuum tubes cracked in the cold. Supplies ran low. And then silence from Berlin. They tried to contact the Naval Command, the Luftwaffe, even U-boat bases in Norway. Nothing. It was as if the world had vanished. Dr. Deej kept his team working anyway. He told them the war would end soon, that Germany would win, that their work mattered. But deep down, he knew. He wrote in his journal, "The instruments continue, the wind continues, we continue, but I fear we are measuring the weather for a country that no longer exists."
In August 1944, the last supply U-boat reached them, bringing mail, ammunition, and a short letter. Hold position, continue reporting, await further orders. They never received another. By winter 1944, the Reich was collapsing. Berlin was burning. The Allies had crossed France. Yet in the Arctic, the men of Haudegen still stood watch, still recording, still transmitting, unaware that D-Day had come and gone, unaware that the storm they had measured had changed history. The storm that struck the Channel on June 5th forced Eisenhower to delay the invasion by 1 day. Just 1 day, but it made all the difference. Had it hit during the landings, the waves and wind could have destroyed the landing craft, scattered paratroopers, and turned Normandy into a slaughterhouse. And the Germans? They were caught unprepared. Their own forecasts told them no invasion was possible in such weather. Rommel had gone home to visit his wife. Their armies rested, their defenses were relaxed, because they had ignored the Arctic. Haudegen's data, if trusted, would have painted a truer picture, showing that the storm would break earlier than predicted, that the Allies would have a narrow 24-hour window of calm. That's the window Eisenhower used. So in a way, the war turned on a misread weather map, and the men who could have warned everyone were 2,000 miles away, buried in ice, forgotten. The months that followed turned their mission into survival. They built sleds from scrap wood, used seal blubber for heat, rationed every last can. The isolation ate away at them. One man began talking to the wind, another stopped speaking entirely. And still, Dr. Deej kept writing weather logs, day after day, until his last entry in April 1945. Visibility poor, sky overcast, temperature -16, no reply from base. He didn't know that, by then, Hitler was dead, that Germany had surrendered, that the war was over.
June 1944. The English countryside trembled with anticipation. Fields were filled with rows of landing craft. Parachutes lay folded in neat stacks. Tens of thousands of soldiers wrote last letters home, unaware of what the next dawn would bring. And in a small, smoke-filled room in southern England, the fate of the entire invasion hung not on generals or admirals, but on weathermen. The Allied command met inside Southwick House, a grand old estate turned nerve center of Operation Overlord. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, tension, and the smell of wet uniforms. Outside, rain lashed against the windows. The sea beyond Portsmouth churned like an angry beast. At the head of the table sat General Dwight D. Eisenhower, tired, calm, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Across from him were his meteorologists, Group Captain James Stagg of the Royal Air Force, and his American counterpart, Colonel Irving Crick. They had one job: to predict the weather for the most ambitious invasion in human history. If they were wrong, 156,000 men could die before even reaching the beach. If they delayed too long, the tides and moonlight would turn against them. And if they waited another month, the Nazis might discover the plan. Every forecast, every whisper of wind carried the weight of the war. The data they had was incomplete. The Allies had lost many of their weather stations in Norway and the Arctic early in the war. They relied on a handful of ships in the North Atlantic and scattered posts in Iceland and Greenland. They knew storms were forming somewhere far north, but they couldn't see the full picture. If they'd had Haudegen's readings, those precise Arctic barometer readings and wind fronts, they could have tracked the storm's movement days earlier. They could have known its strength, its timing, its brief calm. Instead, they guessed.
On June 4th, the invasion was ready. Troops were loaded onto ships. Paratroopers boarded their planes. But the sea was turning. Winds of over 40 miles an hour roared across the Channel. Waves rose 6 feet high. At 4 a.m., the room at Southwick fell silent as Stagg entered, his cap dripping rain. He placed his charts on the table and said, "The weather is breaking down. I advise delay." A murmur swept the room. Admiral Ramsay cursed under his breath. Montgomery slammed his hand on the table, and Eisenhower just stared out the window. He had 156,000 men waiting, a fleet of 5,000 ships already at sea, and now he had to tell them to wait. That decision, to delay D-Day by 24 hours, changed the world. But what if Stagg had been wrong? What if the storm never passed? What if the Germans had seen the same storm and prepared differently? Far above the Atlantic, on Nordost-London, Dr. Wilhelm Daeg's barometers had already captured the same storm's birth days earlier. His readings showed a deep, low-pressure front forming near Greenland and moving rapidly toward the Channel. Then, just as quickly, it weakened. A temporary calm, a short window of opportunity would follow before another massive front rolled in. His last transmission before radio silence described that lull in exact numbers. Had it reached Berlin, the German High Command would have known the same thing the Allies were only beginning to suspect, that a brief weather window was coming. Instead, the report was delayed, buried in the chaos of the collapsing Reich's communication network. So when June 5th arrived, the Germans looked at their own forecasts, incomplete, outdated, and based on missing Arctic data, and concluded that no invasion was possible. General Rommel went home to celebrate his wife's birthday. Field commanders relaxed their coastal patrols. Many troops left their bunkers to train inland, believing the weather would stay terrible. And so, when the clouds broke just before dawn on June 6th, and the sea grew calm under a light wind, the German defenses along Normandy were half asleep. At 6:30 a.m., the first landing craft touched the beaches of Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. By nightfall, 150,000 Allied soldiers had landed in France. The tide of the war had turned. But not by luck, by weather.
One man's cautious decision, backed by limited data, intuition, and experience, made D-Day possible. And the irony still echoes through history. The very data that could have warned the Germans of that weather window was sitting, frozen, in a logbook on a desolate Arctic island. Thousands miles north, the men of Haudegen carried on as usual. They didn't know that the war's greatest gamble had already been won and lost. They didn't know that their unread signals might have changed it all. Dr. Dej later wrote, "We thought we were sending numbers into a void. Perhaps we were right. Perhaps the void was listening after all." The Arctic never answered. The war below raged on. But history had already been sealed by a storm and a whisper of data that no one heard. By late summer, the Allied forces had broken through Normandy and were advancing toward Paris. The Nazi Empire was collapsing, its cities burning. And Haudegen, forgotten, unreachable, still transmitted weather reports to a country that no longer existed. Back in Berlin, the few meteorologists who remained alive tried to interpret what little Arctic data they still received. They recognized Haudegen's call sign, Station 243, but they didn't have the resources to decode it, much less act on it. The war was ending in chaos. And so, even as the tides of history shifted, those men in the Arctic, Those unseen, unheard weather soldiers kept their instruments running. Every reading, every transmission, a ritual against despair. They were the last men of the Reich, still at their post. When we look back at D-Day, we see heroes storming the beaches. We hear the thunder of guns and the cry of freedom. But behind it all, in the silence of the Arctic, a handful of men were measuring the breadth of the earth, not knowing that they held the invisible thread that tied destiny together. The weather could have ended it differently. It could have delayed the invasion, drowned the landing craft, scattered the paratroopers, and given the Germans time to regroup. If the storm had lasted a day longer, history itself might have changed course. But it didn't, because one storm broke and another didn't, because one forecast guessed right and another was ignored, because sometimes in war, it's not the loudest voice that matters. It's the quietest one, lost in the wind.
History is full of ghosts, moments that almost happened, choices that could have changed everything. And perhaps none more haunting than this. What if the Arctic had been heard? What if those frozen transmissions from Wetterstation Haudegen had reached Berlin, decoded, believed, and acted upon? Let's imagine. It's late May 1944. In this version of history, the German High Command receives an urgent weather report from the far north. Readings from Dr. Dege's station showing a brief break in the Atlantic storm front. At first, officers at the meteorological office dismiss it as noise. But one young analyst insists the data matches the pattern of a moving low-pressure system that could bring a short calm to the channel. The report climbs the chain of command. By June 4th, it's on the desk of Admiral Karl Dönitz. He frowns, tracing the wind arrows with his finger. If the weather clears tomorrow, then the invasion everyone expects but no one can predict, might come sooner than they think. He orders the message relayed to Rommel's headquarters. Troops along the Normandy coast are placed on alert. Batteries that were half-manned are reinforced. Paratrooper units are put on standby, and for the first time in weeks, the German defenses are fully awake. Meanwhile, in England, Eisenhower still faces his impossible decision. His meteorologists predict the same short window, 24 hours of calm. He gives the order, "We go." But this time, the Germans are ready. At dawn on June 6th, the sea is eerily still. The first Allied waves approach the beaches, but radar stations already track them. Coastal guns open fire sooner. Flak fills the sky. The element of surprise is gone. Paratroopers dropping inland find their landing zones lit with searchlights and tracer rounds. At Omaha Beach, machine guns cut through the first wave before they reach the sand. By midday, the Allies realize their mistake. The losses are catastrophic. Eisenhower faces the unthinkable, a retreat. The invasion fails. The war drags on. Europe remains divided not by ideology, but by weather. But that's the world that didn't happen. Because in the real world, those Arctic numbers never reached Berlin. The radio waves were swallowed by static, by chaos, by disbelief. The storm broke, the skies cleared, and the greatest gamble in human history succeeded.
A year later, when the war was over, the men of Haudegen were still on Nordauslandet, forgotten by both sides. They had no orders, no contact, no idea the world had moved on. In September 1945, a Norwegian expedition found them, alive, thin, bearded, still wearing Wehrmacht insignia. They didn't resist. They simply handed over their pistols and asked, quietly, who won? When they learned the war was over, they smiled faintly. Dr. Deej asked if they could finish one last weather report before leaving. He wanted to close his final log properly. And so he did. The last entry of Wetterstation Haudegen read, temperature -2, wind from the northwest, mission complete. The last German unit to surrender in World War II wasn't a tank division or a submarine crew. It was a handful of scientists who had spent the war measuring clouds, unaware that their silence had already shaped the outcome of history. In the end, history often turns on the smallest hinges: a gust of wind, a drop in pressure, a message lost in the static. The Arctic kept its secret for decades, frozen beneath the snow. But if you listen closely, you can still hear it, a faint pulse from the edge of the world, whispering what might have been. That's the hidden story of the German weather station that almost stopped D-Day. If you enjoyed this story, if you love uncovering the forgotten corners of World War II, where small moments changed the course of history, then please take a second to subscribe to the channel. Every week, we bring you more untold stories, the ones history books forget, but time remembers. Hit the like button if this story moved you, and drop a comment below. Tell me what you'd like to hear next. Because together, we're not just remembering history, we're keeping it alive. Until next time, this is your storyteller, signing off from the echoes of the past.